What is up? What is up, YouTube? This is Dave Croft, and welcome back to another Production Q walkthrough. Hope that you guys are having a stellar day. And on today's walkthrough, I thought it'd be really interesting to take a look at the first cue that I personally ever made air with. This is a track called Sunrise on the Green, and it is an uplifting, inspirational, instrumental track. Completely different from the hip-hop cue that I did previously. A lot of really cool things about this track, a lot of things that I've learned. I've kept this track relatively unchanged from when I submitted it. I did do some organizational things that did some coloring and moved some things around, but I also left the mixing window and everything. I left the mix as is, and there are some absolute things I would change about this track were I to submit it today. But there are also some things that I really learned, some very valuable lessons that I learned in the process of submitting this track. And wasn't the first track that I had submitted for publication, but it was the first track that ever made air. And when it came on, Shannon, my wife, and I, we absolutely had a that thing you do moment where we were watching. This was for the Masters tournament, actually, and we're watching it, and there it is. It shows up, and we're jumping around, hugging, and yay! And we had that experience. So if you've ever seen That Thing You Do, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But like I said, some very valuable lessons I learned in this track. And so let's listen to the rest of it, and then we'll take a deep dive into the sounds, textures, and arrangement, and the lessons that I learned with Sunrise on the Green. So like I said, this track is called Sunrise on the Green and was submitted for the Masters tournament on CBS Sports and was the first track that I ever got air with. Really exciting time. And let's take a walk through the patches. If you've not seen my previous video, the epic orchestral hip hop track Like a Boss, then go check that out. But if you've not seen it, then you're gonna find out some new things. If you have seen it, then you're gonna see some old standbys, because I'm definitely a creature of habit. I like what I like, and I use what I like. So let's start with just the string textures. Starting out here, we just have nice fat string pads, and this is, of course, Symphobia. And there are several reasons I like Symphobia. It just sounds great out of the box. And this was written several years ago, but you'll notice this is Symphobia 1.41. And now they're on 1.61 by now. And one of the things I really like about Project Sam is that they update their library continuously, and those updates have been since the many years that I've had Symphobia have been free. So whether they're cleaning up their sample library, remastering the recordings, or there was one string sample, like crescendo string sample, that had some stand noise, like some music stand noise, and an update cleaned that up, and they improved their engine, and that's all for free. And I know some other plugin companies have different business models regarding that. Some plugin companies will get you in with a fire sale, and it's really cheap, maybe $20 or $30, and then a year later they're like, hey, we've radically improved this, why don't you pay us extra money? Which is their business model, and that's if they want to do that, that's very, very cool. But I would rather pay a little bit more of a premium on the front end and feel really supported, not necessarily nickel and dime. So all that to say, Symphobia updates their library, and what I also like about Symphobia is that it maintains the state of whatever engine you used when you created that track. So I could go in and plug in the latest Symphobia engine here, but it maintains this library or this engine, and that means compatibility is never a problem. So I can open up a queue like this several years later, and it just works. It just works. So that's enough. It's enough loving on Project Sam. And full disclosure, I don't get money from Project Sam. I'm not endorsed by them. They're at the top of my contact library list here because I believe in them, and I really like what they do. All right, so nice fat string pads. Like I said, there are some things I would absolutely change. Like there are some attacks which are a little bit behind the beat, and everything's pretty hard quantized. I do have some overlap here, but it's pretty hard quantized. If I were to do this today, or to either resubmit it or whatever, then I would absolutely tweak some of these attack envelopes, which I did talk about previously. Whoops. And make sure that, like if I turn on the click, here, that's just a little sluggish. I would fix that by putting a negative delay. So it's not quite so behind the beat. Right? If I were conducting this, I would be pulling my strings along. So I would do that a little bit. I did maintain the velocities. I firmly believe that if it's an instrument that would be performed by a human beings with their hands, whether it's a bowed instrument, a plucked instrument, a struck instrument, or a blown instrument, then I firmly believe you should enter it in, even if you have to slow it way down. Go ahead and slow down your tempo here, and play it in slowly. All right, so those are my long strings. My short strings are some Symphobia. I don't know why Lumina keeps opening up. That's annoying, Symphobia. Or that's probably a contact thing. With some Vienna ensemble stacked. Just to add a little bit of bite. I could have gone in and upped my stage microphone here. That sounds a little phasey to me, so I didn't do that. And then I have a third layer, or rather a fourth layer. Yeah, a fourth layer underneath it, just Symphobia, short ensemble, pizzicatos. So yes, if you're counting, I have some strings down here. Pizzicato. I also have some staccato strings. And I also have these long string pads. So that's a lot of strings, right? And if you're watching this and you're a composer's composer, or an orchestrator or arranger, and your bread and butter is making charts and recording orchestras and hiring players and everything, then this is probably making you scream at your computer or your phone, or however you're watching this. And because my output is 99% virtual in the DAW, digital audio workstation, in MIDI, I can consider myself first a MIDI composer. And so while I know that I maybe should, and if I was mocking this up for an orchestral or an orchestral arrangement, if I was mocking this up for real players to play, I'm not going to hire this orchestra to come in here, or this entire string section, this string section with a different set of mics, and this string section to come and play the pizzicatos. Nor would I look at like creating like divisi. Okay, first violins, you're playing these notes. Second violins, you're playing these notes. Violas, we're gonna have to divisi you up. So let's have half of you play this, half of you play this. Cellos, half of you play this. No, because I'm dealing with MIDI orchestration, and I'm not necessarily bound to the limitations of what a real orchestra can and or should fit on a stage, then I can have big fat sounds. What that means is I can have long string pads on top of staccatos occurring simultaneously. Now, do I always want that? Not necessarily. As a matter of fact, I generally try not to. Were I arranging this today, I would probably keep that a little bit more in mind and spread it out. But also keep in mind that we're not listening to this cue. When we hear it, we're not listening to it this loud. No, we're listening to it this loud. With someone talking on top of it. Right? In this case, it would be, Jim Nantz or somebody from CBS Sports. And so that means that you can get away with some of those. You can get away with some of those things. You can get away with engineering techniques. You can get away with not throwing a ton of processes on. Now, I'm not saying that setting your orchestra up so that you don't have all kinds of doubling, or in this case, quadrupling. I'm not saying that that's bad technique. I'm just saying, man, as virtual orchestrators and MIDI programmers and MIDI composers, you don't necessarily have to be bogged down by what should or could happen in real life. Take it into consideration. Absolutely. Don't go completely crazy. But if you want to have 50 taiko drummers show up on your recording session virtually, then have it. Your limitation is only this right here, your CPU and your hard drive, right? That's the limitation that's getting put on this, or your publisher or the client, telling you it's too big. In this case, no, it made for a nice thick, full texture, especially since I didn't have a ton going on, especially early out. Now you'll notice when things get a little bit more involved here, I do thin some things out, but I've also added a choir and some horns, and so yeah, we'll get to that. Okay, so that is my treatise on virtual orchestration, TLDR. You don't have to be bound by the rules of actual applied physics when you're composing. Keep them in mind, but you are not governed by them. All right, so let's move on to my flute patch, which is a patch from a company called Embertone. Embertone is a small boutique sample company out of Raleigh, North Carolina. I was turned on to them by a very good composer friend, and it's just a handful of folks that find really cool instruments and sample them. And so this is a Jubal flute, which is just this little wooden flute, and it's meticulously sampled. Sounds amazing, and it does one thing, but it does that one thing really, really well. And this library was really cheap, like under $30, and I think I got it on sale for like $20 or something like that. Now, Embertone has all these little tiny libraries. They also have a really good library of like water jugs that you would see like on a water cooler. They have a really cool jug. It's called a jug drum library. But they also have really detailed string samples. They have a 200 gigabyte piano library. So it's everything. But this Jubal flute is fantastic. And part of me using this Jubal flute is I wanted that kind of ethereal, elvish. I don't know, Tolkien has a theory on whether you should use elfish, elven, or elvish. Anyway. And I wanted this kind of ethereal, almost fantasy kind of vibe to it, but yeah. That was one consideration. The other consideration was I was not happy with any of my current flute libraries, and that includes Vienna. And I'll talk about Vienna Symphonic here in a minute when we get into some of my other woodwinds, because I am in love with a handful of the Vienna's other woodwinds. So I'm using this Jubal flute. And if we were to look at the programming here, you can see got a couple of things going on in the programming. Namely, I've got a modulation And this was all just done with my mod wheel. One of the things I would do over if I were to reprogram this is I would absolutely clean up some of these lines. You know, this just these kind of things make my brain itch. I would smooth those out, but that's okay. That's all right. And I also have some pitch bends in there, just to recreate that kind of Titanic-y, you know, flute, penny whistle type sound. And I apologize to all penny whistle players, because now penny whistles are just, you know, my heart will go on. It's just everybody assumes that. All right, so the flute is carrying the melody, but that's not the first time we see the melody. The melody originally shows up in my piano, and this is a very common library. It comes with complete from Native Instruments, and it's called The Giant, and it's a sampled piano that you can do a lot of things with, very kind of cinematic type big giant sounds. I'm not gonna record a concerto with this library, but it's just really kind of this intimate sound, and I think it works really, really, really well. By the way, one of the things that I see with my students is the lack of use of sustain pedal. Actually, I see that quite a lot. And sustain pedal. If you don't have a sustain pedal, man, get you one. They're really cheap on Amazon. Just get an M Audio. You can get one of the fancy ones that looks like an actual piano pedal, or you can get one of the little. I carry one that's a little brick looking thing, and I keep it in my bag. It's my travel sustain pedal. But I do see this a lot with some of my students. They'll program piano in, and listen to the difference. That almost sounds comical, but you turn that sustain pedal on, it becomes a whole new thing. Now, I am not a pianist. Yes, I play mallet percussion and drum set and everything like that. But I recorded this on 2 passes. I recorded one pass, just the accompaniment here. Actually, let me do it the other way. So this first pass, which is unapologetically Forrest Gump, Alan Silvestri. That Alan Silvestri's work had such a huge impact on me. It was the Back to the Future soundtrack that I absolutely remember listening to in middle school, and it made me want to be a composer. That soundtrack, the B side of the soundtrack, the cassette. The A side was all like, you know, Dance with Me, Henry, and Johnny B. Good and all that stuff. But the suite, that absolutely made me want to be a composer. And his Forrest Gump soundtrack was amazing. So this is, like I said, this is unapologetically Alan Silvestri, kind of just outlining fifths. So I took one pass of that, and then the other pass was just, I'm just muting out these bottom notes, was the melody. Super simple. I haven't set up a key signature here. I suppose I could do that. I think we are in E flat major at this point before modulating. Yep. And I'm set to a double time tempo, so that's why everything's at quarter notes and not eighth notes here. Hey, I should turn back on my melody, hey? So put them together. Yeah, and so I recorded this in 2 passes. First was the Alan Silvestri, Forrest Gump kind of accompaniment, and then the melody. So I didn't one-shot this, just sitting it down at one time. Okay, and then some harp enters. And man, I love me some ostinatos. I don't know if that's just the percussionist in me, but man, I sure do love some ostinatos. And so that's what's going on here. And so I have this type of this motion here. Then, oops. Then the chord changes. So I change the bottom note, but keep the top notes the same. The bottom note stays the same, and the top notes change. And then we are back to it. With the melody, sounds like this. And by this point, I had brought in the flute. And yeah, and the strings just give a little bit of motion. I don't have a ton of percussion in here as far as non-pitched percussion. All right, so now into the key change, and at this point, I've gotten I've seen my melody here on the piano, here on the flute, and I'm about to give it to my brass. And this is really just an idea of pushing the energy forward and handing it off to a sound. It's going to sound very majestic, sound very, very kind of regal, and of course, my favorite brass horn library is the Cinebrass horns, specifically the two-horn ensemble, and this is also layered on top of some Symphonia brass, just some sustains with no trumpet. Personally, not a huge fan of MIDI trumpet. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I have not found it working much for me. So I gravitate towards my horns. All right, so we modulate. Pass off the melody to the horns. Sounds very kind of regal. Now I can get away with the modulation because this is a feature story type of a cue. We want to maintain vibe and emotion, and key changes can be a little tricky in production music. And always keep in mind, we're writing production music or library cue tracks here. That's what we're writing. We're not necessarily making art. And I'm sure I'll talk about this in a future video. We're not making art here. What we're doing is making music that's going to sit underneath a scene. And while that happens in film music, somebody gives a composer a piece of video, and then the composer writes music to match that scene. But with library music, the film, whoever's scoring the film isn't the composer, but rather the editor. And the editor says, I need this emotion. And so they're going to look through their library and grab a track, a 2-minute cue, and they might just need 15 or 30 seconds. And they're going to extract 30 seconds of emotion from the cue, from a library of music, and pop it in. And then when the scene changes emotion, like let's say we're underscoring a detective scene. And the detective scene goes from a chase to a hunt, right? To the energy slows down. So at the beginning might be high energy, big strings and brass and percussion. But then the energy changes. If I was scoring that, then I would watch the scene, and at this frame marker or whatever, I would change the energy and ramp it down. But with library music, an editor takes a cue, an action cue, and then takes maybe a tension cue and weaves them and stitches them together. So the emotion feels like one emotion. And a good editor will make it feel and sound underscored. So all that to say, this is why changing keys can be a little tough, because you want to give an editor as much to work with, and you want builds and structure and everything, and every every 4 bars or every phrase something new is happening. You're building energy and resolving energy, building tension and releasing tension. But it all still has to be one overarching emotion. And so changing keys can sometimes get in the way of that. In this, I think we're okay. Now, I will say, when this track was used, 52 seconds, this is a 2 minutes and 35 seconds or so. This was cut around this point, and then it came all the way in again right around in here. And so none of this business was used when it actually made air. And that's their prerogative. And they did it masterfully. And they managed to have the end and it, and I don't think I can kind of recreate how they cut it. Because this chord was the same chord as that chord there. Like they punched it back in, halfway through the phrase, and it was really well done, to the point where I was like, I should have written it like that. It's really good. All right, so the brass sounds, some symphobia. It's the same melody. I did have to tweak some of the modulation a little bit just to make it work with the horns. You can see it's a lot more smoothed out than my flute patches. My harp is doing something a little bit different here. Now, I did not just play all this in like in real time. I used the step editor or the MIDI input, and I was able to step in each one of these notes, and whatever value I set my grid, here is the values that is entered there. And I do this all the time for harps. All the time for harp. Just one note at a time. That way you can make it sound glissy. And I know there's probably a harp player out there who would look at this, and by this point I am in, I think, F major here. Would look at this and go, that's not playable. And if I were a harp player, I might program that differently for the very same reason that as a drummer, I program my drums to be as realistic as possible. That means that if I'm writing a drum set part, I'm not going to write it for a drummer that has 9 arms. All right, so, and I added a choir here. And this gets us actually into my B section. And let me play a little bit of that B section. Just a little departure B section. No real, like, solid melody necessarily, per se. Just kind of chords padding. Then my oboe comes in here. And here is some Vienna Symphonic. Man, what they do really well. They do woodwinds exceedingly well, except for flute. But woodwinds, primarily oboes, clarinets, bassoons, sound so good. So good. Absolutely love this. Oh, it's so good. The legato transitions, from when the note changes. You hear that little there's a little break when the note changes. And those legato transitions, those are what really makes ensemble, or not ensemble, but MIDI libraries really good. It's also what makes them expensive. And that's what makes them complicated and why I could never be a sample creator, sample library creator, because that's a lot of really complex math. So basically, whenever like an oboe player, I do not play oboe. Whenever an oboe player changes notes, or any wind player really, from a high note to a low note, or from a low note to a high note, then their fingers have to change, their embouchure has to change, and they have to. There's muscles that engage, contract, release, whatever, to change that note. It's not like on a piano where I can just go. But when I change, it's step entering. Oh, that's weird. That's because I have that turned on. Let's undo whatever I just did. Let's delete that noise. Right, so there's the note. So there are those two notes, but there's also the sound of the note changing from low. That little break, that's another sample that gets recorded and then gets inserted. And regardless of what note I go up to, these it was the oboe, clarinet, and bassoon that absolutely sold me onto this library. I think they are worth the price of admission. Worth the price of admission alone. So now, if you're keeping score at home, kids, this is now the third instrument: piano, flute, brass, oboe, playing the melody. And by this point, I think, yep, oboe along with the piano. The piano's been playing it the whole time. Piano player's like, Dave told me to keep playing the melody. I'm going to keep playing the melody. So I'm going to tag my melody here at the end, pass it back to the flute, basically bookending, creating symmetry. Oh, listen to the. You hear I feel like I can hear the flute kind of changing, or the flute player changing their embouchure in that. Those are the details. Those are the fine details that really separate good libraries from great libraries, which is why I love what Embertone does. And I love that I live in a time where computers can do this. It's not that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, nobody wanted to be able to do this. They just couldn't do it because the computers couldn't handle it. All right, so let's back up just a little bit. Let's talk about some of this percussion. First of all is a suspended cymbal, and I spent a shamefully long amount of time looking for and looking to buy. Like, I had my credit card ready. I will buy whatever sample library has a great, or a plethora of suspended cymbals. I have a good one. Logic has a good one in their orchestral kit, but I had used that so many times, and it dawned on me after a comically long amount of time of searching, that I could just dust off some cymbals of my own, because I am a drummer, and record them myself, and I did. I recorded them with this mic. With this very mic. Now, I know this says a stereo sample, but it's not a stereo sample. It's just a doubled mono sample. What I do like to do is throw on a sample delay. By the way, I think I called this stereo delay in the last video. Called a sample delay. And what this does is it widens the sound. Let me play it. Let me turn off some reverb here. All right, so that's coming down right down the middle. Let me throw on the sample delay. All right, what it essentially does is I am delaying the left side by, at this point, 1,111 samples. I'm sure that translates to some fraction of a second or milliseconds or whatever. But I'm essentially making the left side come in late, which your brain doesn't hear as late. What your brain hears is it hears it in stereo space. It's called the Haas effect, essentially. And that's what we're doing here is I'm taking a mono sound source, putting on a sample delay to make it sound like very much out of phase stereo sample, which is kind of what makes stereo samples sound the way they do. And I've used this trick with mono recordings. I get stems from an acoustic guitar, mandolin, dobro player that I collaborate with. He lives out in San Antonio. He doesn't have a really fancy setup, and he sends me mono stems all the time. And I do this to this. I just throw on a sample delay. Nothing fancy, which could be that's the title of my ethos or my biographies. Nothing fancy. Also, I have a mark tree here. This is just a bell tree that I recorded. I did sample these both. Excuse me. I did record these both rather using Ableton Live, and I recorded them in at a certain tempo, and I recorded several different suspended cymbals. I recorded several different tempos, and I recorded them into Ableton Live because let's all agree that Ableton Live's time stretching is vastly superior to Logic's. I love Logic. I love you, Logic, but your the flex time and everything is not ready for prime time. And Ableton Live has been doing it much longer, and they are exceedingly better at it than you are. And so I record those samples into Ableton Live, and then whenever I need, let's say I need 1 bar at 120 beats per minute, then I will open up Ableton and I will just spit it out, and I stick it in my library here. And let's see, and now I have a whole bank of them by now that I can just throw in. And at this point, I have so many various tempos and various lengths that I just if it's close enough, if it's within 5 BPM or something, then I'll use that. There's another suspended cymbal. That's 4 bars. Here's 4 bars. That was 2 bars. Here's 2 bars. So yeah, I just brought them into Ableton Live, recorded them into Ableton Live, and then created these different stretched versions. Have a couple of concert percussion, Vienna ensemble triangle. Ding. Right, just adding a little bit. This is a Contact library. I was really looking for a deep concert bass drum, and this is Drums of War by Cinesamples. Same folks that make Cinebrass, which are my favorite library, my favorite horn library. I've got some timpani down here, pressing energy into and this library is just standard complete library that comes with, I think it might be called the Contact library. It comes with complete. Yep. So it's not a uber fancy, just got some tubular bells here, which are actually Vienna ensemble. These days I use Vienna more for my timpani, my gongs and such. And this tubular bell part, this is, I wanted this, honestly, not the inspiration, but the idea behind this, I wanted it to be like Christmas morning, ding dong ding, or like marriage, wedding bells, that kind of thing. I definitely wanted this to be this really kind of emotional, very uplifting, again, the wedding bells, the church bells going crazy. All right, so those are all my sounds. And if I'm looking at the arrangement, it's 16 bar phrase, and it's really an 8 bar phrase because this is set to a double time. Starting out, piano melody. Now, originally, you'll notice this is called short. It's also called version 6 because that's how many different versions I did for the publisher when we were working through this track. This was this had a really long, protracted intro, which was great. My publisher was like, "I love it, Dave, but we can't use it." And so any editor, in this case, this was for a feature story, is going to skip past all of that. It's really kind of emotional piano type opening. And so instead of hoping the editor will fast forward through it, we'll just create an edit that starts right when the melody comes in. All right, so I have my flute playing the melody. And you notice that the string pads go, it's very straightforward, kind of big open string sounds here. As the phrase progresses, it gets a little bit more dense. And then when we get into the next phrase, adding harmonies to my staccato strings, adding density, key change. You'll also notice that some of the velocities are starting to get higher. Like if we look at these, this is creating energy as we ramp up intensity into my B section. So it's not just like straight copy and paste, right? It's either retracking, or if you are copying and pasting or alt dragging or whatever. I have nothing against copy and pasting, believe me. Remember, we're not making art necessarily. What we're doing is we're making something that somebody's going to use. And so if you're making a lot of them, a lot of tracks, you need a lot of tracks and a lot of libraries. Yeah, you take whatever shortcuts or whatever techniques you want to use. All right. So my string, by the way, that should be. It's weird how it's still instrument 2. Anyway. So my pads kind of open up a little bit into my choir. Oh, I don't think I ever looked at my choir sound. This is just stock complete. All right, so we're pushing energy here, and this is really kind of the climax of the tune. This is as intense as it's going to get. Everything else from here is the tide going out. Everything. This is the crest. This is the wave crashing. Wave building, wave crashing. Okay. And from this point on, we're pulling energy back. This is the tide going out, or the wave coming back. And so my brass, instead of playing the melody, my brass is just playing some nice long notes here. Just a nice little walking line. Not just playing roots. Maybe considered a counter melody. All right, so still pulling energy back. Gonna pass the flute the melody as we're coming in for a landing. And there's my ending. Now, originally, let's talk about some of the lessons. The biggest lesson I learned. Originally, this track ended on a nice, juicy 4-chord. Nice, juicy, I think it was a B flat chord, 4-chord, because we're in F. And I loved it. Partially because I love unresolved plagal cadences, right? I love like the longing, the artistic longing of unresolved love, right? And I was thinking about it way too artistically here. But I ended on a 4-chord, and it worked. It was beautiful, and it was the artistic thing that I wanted to say. I gave it to my publisher, and just like the big intro, he said, "Dave, I love it. This last chord is so expertly done, and I really, really dig it, but we can't end on a 4-chord. It makes sense artistically, but it doesn't make sense from the standpoint of an editor. An editor is not going to think, they're not going to hear that unresolved, a half plagal cadence and think, that creates a sense of longing. And that's what I want to use. I want that sense of longing. No, what they're going to think is, this doesn't sound finished. This doesn't sound like it has a resolution or it concludes. And so they're not going to go back to the publisher and say, hey, do you have something can you ask the composer to change this to a one chord? No, what they're going to do, what the editor is going to do is just move along to the next track. And so he kicked it back, and I was really grumpy about it. If I'm being honest, my ego kind of took a bruising a little bit, and I was grumpy about it. And so I added this one chord here at the end, almost sarcastically, like it was just this thick kind of one chord, which if I'm just being honest and transparent, at the time I felt it was too cheesy. This is too cheesy. But don't you know that when this aired, the segment, this Sunrise on the Green was used during, I believe it was the Raymond Floyd introspective for the Masters tournament a few years ago. And this was used during a segment where he's talking about his wife having passed. And this was used as he was talking about spreading his wife's ashes around one of the trees at Augusta National. And he says, this is how, I know she would want to be remembered, and I know she's happy here. I'm getting emotional about it. And he says the last line, title card comes up, and it fades to black for a split second before cutting to commercial. And it was a very powerful moment. I felt, maybe I may have overthinking it, but there is no doubt in my mind, that if I had ended on a 4 chord, that they wouldn't have used it. And little could I imagine how an editor would use that final chord to serve as closure for a man talking about losing his wife and his wife passing away, and how she wants to be remembered, And I learned a very valuable lesson. First of all, I'm not necessarily making this music for me. I'm making this music to help other people tell their story, and I want to make it good, and I want to make it easy for them. And I learned that lesson that way, watching that happen and seeing it used. And since then, I always end my tunes and my tracks on a one chord. Some of it is very practical. Just tell them when to clap. You got to give editors what they want. They expect a one chord. It's on the downbeat, and give them what they need. Give them what they want. Make their jobs easy on them. But I never could have imagined that this chord, which I was so, like I said, at the time, almost sarcastically, really in my own like grumpy ego energy, little could I have imagined how an editor will take that. And I'm not necessarily, I don't mean to like project any of my own. It could have just been, hey, I like that chord, snip it and cut it in. But it had an impact on me. And I hope it had an impact on other, on viewers. I hope so. So that was a really, really important lesson that I learned in that. As I look back on this, there are absolutely things I would change. I already talked about some of the MIDI programming I would change, but I would also, look at this. What's missing here? Man, I didn't throw EQs on this. Oh my God. I didn't EQ my strings. Why the pizzicatos got some, they were lucky, I guess. Yay, we got an EQ, but I didn't EQ my strings. I didn't EQ my brass. I didn't even like check my metering here. Really, really very simple mastering chain, just of a little EQ, some compression, and a limiter to get us up to our levels. But now I would use ozone, and I would get into imaging and all that stuff. But there's something to be said about the simplicity. Keeping it simple. Oh my gosh, keep it simple. And I've had a music supervisor tell me they enjoy my tracks because I don't over process everything. And I did talk about this in previous video, and not being bogged down by what I know I could do to a track. And I think that also manifests itself. It manifests itself in my mixing and my engineering, but I think it probably also manifests itself in my programming. I don't feel constricted by the limitations of what an orchestra can do. I'm just like, what sounds good, and what gives me the sound that I'm looking for. And so if that means that I have 120 string players show up to my session, awesome. If I were to take this and give it to an orchestrator, then they would absolutely have to divide up these parts. Because if I'm scoring this, if this was being scored on a stage, we're not going to hire 120 string players. So it might sound a little bit different. It would sound better and much more realistic. But I'm not necessarily bogged down by those limitations. So that is Sunrise on the Green. I really sincerely hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. And if you like it, go ahead and leave a comment. I covet your comments and will absolutely respond to those comments. I've also set up a little Patreon that you can check out at patreon.com/Dave Croft. Nothing fancy. Again, title of my biography. Nothing fancy, just $1 a month. You can support me and support these videos. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for watching. And I hope you got a lot out of it. Until next time, peace.